tea time without Tusk. It's tea time without Tusk. Yay! Right. Actually, it's video game tea time. The Lord of the Rings Online has an in-game an in-game recipe. Good start! Stop here, start again. An in-game recipe for whey bread. And also an in-game recipe for Lembas, which is very different from the in-game recipe for whey bread, which is kind of silly. Now, it's basically a kind of bread, and bread is bread flour, which is flour with extra gluten. Gluten being a protein found in wheat and a few other things that binds bread together. It's what makes it bread rather than rice pudding. Without the gluten, you might get cake if you're lucky, you might get mush. Or of course you could use something else to bind it. You need the flour, that's most of your bread. You also need yeast to fluff it up. Yeast. Now this is quick yeast, which actually has instructions saying mix it into the flour before you add the liquid. But the recipe I have says you wake your yeast up in warm water. Now the recipe I learned was so old that it actually said use half a pint of warm water and a pound of butter. Jesus! A pound of flour for a pound of butter. Scary thought. And half an ounce of butter. Or butter if you're in Yorkshire. Or butter if you're convicted tax fraudster and domestic violence abuser, Kent Hovind. And butter, back in the days when that recipe was written, came in 8-ounce blocks. When Britain went to, when the UK went to metric, they carried on making 8-ounce blocks. They just labelled them 227 grams. As you can see right there. Same thing. I went to the small local shop to support my small local business owner, and he didn't have an 8-ounce block of cow's milk butter. He had goat's milk butter, which is possibly more dense and actually in 250 grams. Must be a new product. Near enough the same thing. You also need sugar to feed the yeast. So what you would do is mix a couple of tablespoons of sugar into that water, add a couple of tablespoons of the yeast. You don't actually need 2 of each, but I think it's 1 of one and 2 of the other, but I can't remember which around, so 2 of each is fine. That noise you're hearing is a hot water on demand boiler, which you can use to get your warm water, which is great. Or you can use cold water and boiling water in the right ratio. If your cold water is at 10 and your boiling water is at 100, 4 parts cold, 1 part boiling will get you at about 28, which is good enough. You want ideally about 35, 37, but you know, yeast copes at 25, it's fine, just don't boil the yeast to death. So anyway, you would mix your sugar and your yeast into your water and it would foam up. The reason it's in such a big jug rather than little 1 pint jug is that it foams up about this far if you take too long with the other bits. Your flour can be weighed out in here, but then go into the glass bowl, which already has flour in from previous attempts. And into that you would add your butter and stick it in the electric oven at 60 centigrade to melt the butter. And then smush the butter into the flour, so you get very slightly buttered flour. If you want to be vegan, you can use olive oil, 3 teaspoons of olive oil to 1 ounce of butter. I thought I said half an ounce, I did say half an ounce of butter. I found using 1 ounce of butter, just an 1/8 of the block, because it comes in an 8-ounce block. It doesn't matter what it says on the label, if it's an 8-ounce block, cut it into 8s, those are ounces. You can use 1 ounce of butter, you can use 3 teaspoons of olive oil, you can use 1 teaspoon of olive oil or 5 teaspoons of olive oil. It'll make bread. I find that olive oil and flour is like a non-Newtonian brick. When you try to smoosh it together, it turns rock hard and then just crumbles to dust again. Whereas butter, molten butter with flour, feels lovely. So that's your basic bread recipe. You would then dribble your yeast water into the flour a little at a time and mix it in really thoroughly each time until it forms a ball that leaves no crumbs in the bowl but isn't so wet that it sticks to the bowl. And then you can form loaves or rolls or croissants or pizza bases or buns, whatever you like. The in-game recipe does not say anything about strong white bread flour, or yeast, or water, or sugar. Now, the in-game recipe says to make whey bread you use honey, barley flour, which nobody has, but I found wholemeal rye flour, which is tasty enough stuff, pleasant enough, and cream. Now, if you look at the ingredients on the cream here, what have we got? Fat, 50.5 grams per 100 millilitres. So there is quite a lot of fat in there, so you would think, well, don't need the butter then, do I? I tried it that way. I tried using the cream in place of the butter and the water. Turns out putting a yeast in cream doesn't work very well. I think the yeast probably turned something into acid and curdled the cream and trapped itself in the curds. It also turns out, I think, that honey inhibits the yeast, because I made several batches. One batch I put the honey and the yeast in cream, and that turned into something with the consistency of mayonnaise, and it made bread, but the bread did not rise. They were tiny buns. Like really, really tiny little buns. And kind of heavy, kind of dense. Tasty, but kind of dense. Another batch I mixed the cream into the flour, and then added yeast water, and then I had to add more flour to soak up the yeast water, or there wouldn't have been enough yeast in there, and that worked pretty well. Another batch I added cream and honey. Sorry, another batch I used honey in the water, and that did work. It fluffed up more than the batch where I'd put the yeast in cream, but it didn't fluff up as much as the batch with no honey, so I suspect that honey inhibits yeast. And I had some flour left over, and I had some oatmeal. You can add oatmeal to your flour if you want to, there is nothing wrong with doing so. You can add sesame seeds, I had some of those, so I threw some of them in. You can add wholemeal rye flour, you can add rice flour, you can add whatever you feel like really. Mix all kinds of stuff in. And I didn't use any fat at all in that fourth batch. First time I've ever made bread with no fat, and it did work. I successfully made bread with no added fat. Unpleasantly dry buns, but it worked. One other thing you can add to all of that stuff, excuse me while I show you a kitchen sink for a moment, because I forgot to grab this ingredient. Olives. You want to wash the brine off. These are almost certainly in brine, even if it doesn't say so on the label. And yeah. Ingredients: olives, water, salt, ferrous gluconate. Oh, added iron, that's nice. Yes, it does say sliced black olives in brine. 120 grams of olives and 120 grams of brine. You can also mix olives into your dough before you form loaves. If you do, I suggest mixing them into 2/3 of the dough and then wrapping the other third around the outside, so the olives are all on the inside of the bread, not exposed to the heat of the oven directly and not burning. Right, that's my ingredients, and what I am now going to do is start portraying a variation on those recipes, where I think I can do better. I'm going to have the butter, which makes it more moist, use water to liven up the yeast so that it does fluff up, but use a smaller quantity of water and mostly cream so that it's all creamy and sweet. And once I have something else to show you, I'll be back.